Well, good evening. How am I that loud? Gracious me. I think I need to be a little bit quieter. Well, it's lovely to see you, and it's amazing to see some of you again who were here last evening. Maybe you thought that there was a compilation of speakers this week. Let me tell you, it's me every night. So just in case you're thinking about coming tomorrow night, it'll be me again. On behalf of Judy, my wife, and myself, I'm very grateful to be with you. For those of you who don't know me at all, you probably know as much about me as you need to, in that I am married to Judy and my name is Keith. We have two children, Luke and Anna Marie. They're both married. One lives in the Lake District and the other in Stoke-on-Trent. And between them they have 5 granddaughters. Poppy Willow, Liberty Blossom, Phoebe Meadow, Megan Faye, and Penny Ray. I can now relax and preach because I've got their names right, and what you didn't see was Judy just give me a little round of applause. They're all under 7. We love them dearly. And there was an occasion, and this is probably why Judy did give me a little applause, there was an occasion some while ago when I foolishly decided to name them in public, and although we look very confident as speakers, sometimes strange things happen to our brains when we're on a platform, and I forgot Libby's name. And I couldn't say I've forgotten the second eldest granddaughter, so I called her Millie. It was close. I knew it wasn't right, but at least it was better than saying I've forgotten her name. I've not plucked up the courage to tell her. I have told my daughter, and she forgave me very graciously. But there's always that nervousness that if I try it again, pride will come before a fall, and I will get it wrong. But this time, I got it right. So, but will I get my sermon right? Well, I certainly hope so. But before I do talk to you, I would like to introduce some of the resources that I have downstairs. The books are mainly about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And please don't be put off by the fact that I'm a doctor. They are intended to help us develop a relationship with Jesus, the Father, and the Spirit, or refresh or increase our awareness of who they are and their deep determination to encounter us and for us to experience them. Last evening I spoke about a book about God the Father, but this evening I just want to mention this one to you. There are a couple of books about Jesus, and if you've enjoyed the sermon this evening, then you can read it again in this book, but it'll be a little bit longer. It's The Miracles of Jesus, and the strapline is, what do they teach us about Jesus? But the other aspect of our resources are, well, let me give you a context. One of the biggest challenges facing the Church of Jesus in the world today, but particularly in the White West, is that the Bible is being marginalized in a way that it wasn't when I was growing up as a youngster in the hills of South Wales. There, the Bible was part of our lives as young people. But the more I travel around the world, I see this subliminal sidelining of the Bible from churches, from services, and from the lives of individual Christians. And it's not because they're bad people or because they've lost their love for Jesus. It's because they're not so convinced that the Bible is as helpful to them as they might have thought it was. And for the past 5 years, particularly since I've left lecturing full-time, it's been Judy and myself, our deep desire to help Christians re-engage or engage with the Bible in ways that will be enjoyable, and as a result of exploring it and discovering truth in it and applying that truth, they will find themselves recognizing the remarkable nature of this book that God has given to us. And so as a result of that, we have developed some Bible study resources. They're basically a DVD and a little booklet which functions as questions and answers. People use it in their personal devotions or in their life groups or in church-based Bible schools, or denominations are using them in training of leaders. If you think that this could be of value to you, then please take a look at them downstairs. Well, that's enough of me and what I've written. Let me tell you what I want to talk about tonight. Last evening, if you were with us, you heard me explore with you the fact that the creator of the universe is keen to share time with us. Remarkable, preposterous though it might appear to be, shocking to our intellect, the one who has created the universe desires to invest in us time, his time. Despite all that he has to do, he is keen to spend time with us and to lead us to himself in a way that is personal and individual. And even though it takes time, that's fine as far as he's concerned. And we looked at the Bible story to support that. Well, I want us this evening to explore something else that is almost as preposterous. Let me give you a context. The angels were waiting, they were watching, they were wondering because God was about to create his grand design and to create the universe. And he did it all by himself. The angels weren't there to help him. He did it by himself because he is that omnipotent creator being that the Bible refers to. Funnily enough, the Jewish people believed and still do believe that the angels functioned as a kind of a consultative group that helped God put into operation his plans. That, of course, is not what the Bible says. He did it himself. But here's the remarkable truth that Jesus reveals in his lifetime. There's been a change. And now God, who has plans and ambitions and aspirations and objectives that he could complete easily by himself, chooses to complete them with our help. Our help? What can we do to help God? For goodness sake, we're probably going to slow him down, if not mess it up. It is so shocking a truth that Matthew in his gospel tells at least 3 stories to help his readers realize the truth of this fact. It is not to elevate us or to make us proud or to think that there is something special, but it is to encourage us to ask the question, why God do you do that? Why do you choose to involve us in enabling you to complete your design, which you could do all on your own? That's what we're about this evening. And in order to do it, we're going to look at a couple of the miracles of Jesus. I have a couple of aims every evening. One is to ask the question, why is it that the gospel writers record the healings and other miracles of Jesus? Is it simply to record that Jesus was a healer and a miracle worker, which he was both? Or is there something else as well, even more grand than that? And in order for us to arrive at a conclusion, I come to my second purpose in these evenings, and that is to say that the more we think like a first century reader, the more we are better able to appreciate why the writers include these stories in their Gospels and why they write them in the ways that they write them. You see, the Gospels weren't written to us. They were written to first century people. And those first century people had needs, challenges, aspirations that are very different to us. And the gospel writers intended to meet those needs. That's not to say that we can't learn from them. Of course we can. But if we think like a first century reader, then we have a better ability to appreciate why the stories were told in the first place and why they were told in the ways that they were told. And then we can apply them to ourselves. So the stories that we're going to look at this evening are actually recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Last evening it was the Gospel of Mark, the story that we looked at. And this evening we're going to look at the story that was read for us that only Matthew records about Jesus and the shekel in the fish's mouth. Now let me just tell you something about Matthew before I actually address this story. Matthew wasn't the first Gospel to be written. Mark was the first Gospel to be written. So why was Matthew put first? Well, it was partly to honor the fact that Matthew was one of the disciples of Jesus. Mark, of course, wasn't one of the disciples of Jesus, neither was Luke. Matthew is put first for that reason. But much more importantly, Matthew's gospel is put first in the compilation of the Gospels because in the early church, Matthew's gospel was known as the teaching gospel. That's not to say that Mark and Luke and John weren't teaching the Christians. Of course they were. But Matthew had a dedicated aim to teach the young Christians how to develop within the Christian community that Jesus called church, ecclesia. And it's Matthew who's the only gospel writer to include that word church in his gospel in chapter 16 and in chapter 18. So when you think of Matthew who has an aim to help the Christians develop in their position, their status as disciples of Jesus. Sons and daughters of God, yes, but as disciples, people who are following in the footsteps of Jesus. And he does that teaching through his 5 sermons, but he also does it through his healings, Jesus' healings, and Jesus' miracles. So that's why I'm coming to look at Matthew's gospel and see what he has to say about our status as the followers of Jesus. So let's look at story number 1. There were just the 2 of them. They were together, sitting by the sea. The weather was warm, as it often is in 1st century Israel and in 21st century Israel. Water cool to the touch, and they are enjoying each other's company, the leader and the follower. Of course, the follower isn't the best follower, he knows that, but he's better than he was, and he's going to be better. His name is Peter. And the leader, well, he's Jesus, and he's just perfect. But they don't often have the occasion to be together with one another. And so they relish this opportunity to relate together in privacy, particularly Peter. But that moment is spoilt because some bossy busybodies push their way into their space and they demand money. Of course, they're not robbers or brigands. They're actually going about their lawful service. They are tax collectors from the Jerusalem temple. And every Jew aged 18 or over every year has to pay half a shekel to the temple coffers for its maintenance. It's not an insubstantial amount. It's about 2 days' wage for a working man. And for the Jewish people who are taxed at least 40% and are already on the poverty line or less, the vast majority of them, this is just an extra burden. The question is, will Jesus pay the temple tax? Now, if you hadn't have known the end of the story, you have heard the end of the story, and so you know that Jesus does pay the temple tax. But let me take you back to that story and put yourself in the audience. So the people are asking Jesus to pay the temple tax. Now, there are plenty of people in that audience who are watching who will be pleased if Jesus says, no, I am not going to pay the temple tax. After all, my Father is the God of the temple. There were Pharisees in the audience. Pharisees were one of the major religious parties in the 1st century. They didn't have much to do with the temple because they felt that it was corrupt. And to be honest, it was. Injustice and nepotism permeated the temple. And the Pharisees withdrew from the temple and instead set up synagogues, places where they studied the law of God. And many of them desired to engage in relationship with God, but unfortunately, they got themselves into significant burdens by trying to keep every aspect of the law because they felt that was the only way that they could please God. And it was impossible so to do because they hadn't learned about the grace that was associated with God. But they would have been keen to have heard Jesus saying, no, I'm not going to pay the temple tax to this corrupt temple. Even some of the Sadducees, and the Sadducees were not friends of the Pharisees in the 1st century. Sadducees were associated with the temple. They were aristocrats. They were of the high priestly party. They were well off. They lived in the southern part of Jerusalem, just south of Jerusalem temple, in the richest part of the city. But even some of them were getting uncomfortable about the temple tax because the temple already had so much money. And a couple of years after this event in the life of Jesus, the temple authorities actually discussed what they were going to do with all the money that they had because they needed to spend it. What's Jesus going to do? Is he going to pay the temple tax or not? Well, it looks as if it was potentially a little bit embarrassing because it doesn't appear that Jesus had any money. But then Jesus could have easily manufactured coins out of nothing and flicked them in the direction of the temple tax collectors. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, and we heard it in the reading, he asks Peter to go catch a fish. Peter says, I can do that. And maybe Peter has understood the plan of Jesus, or at least he thinks he has understood the plan of Jesus. He probably thinks, well, now Jesus wants me to go and catch a fish. And when I go and catch the fish, I will take it to the market, I will sell it, and I will bring the money to Jesus so that Jesus can pay the temple tax authorities. It's not the plan of Jesus, but it's an interesting plan. But why does Jesus ask Peter to catch the fish in which the shekel is? If he wanted to pay the temple tax authorities, surely he could have just created money out of nothing if he didn't have money. Just a few days before, Jesus was on that mountain that we know as the Mount of Transfiguration, and the godness of Jesus was shown to the 3 disciples who were with him because this bright light transformed him, and his godness shone through just for a moment or two. And before that, he was in the synagogue, and a man in the audience interrupted his sermon. He was demonized, and Jesus, in a moment, stops that demon functioning and removes him from that man. Oh yes, Jesus has all power available to him. So why, Jesus, do you slow down your objective of paying the temple tax authorities with money by asking Peter to help you? Why don't you do it on your own? Why do you need Peter to be involved in the process? Well, here's my first question, and you don't have to answer this question out loud, and if I was you, I wouldn't answer this question out loud, but that's not because you will get it wrong, but I would always be nervous if I was to give an answer as to why I said that answer. Here's my question. Who did the miracle? Who achieved the miracle of that fish having the shekel in it, as a result of which he, Jesus, could give it to the temple tax authorities? And your answer to me is, Keith, it's obvious. It's Jesus who created that miracle. It was Jesus who was the one who instructed that fish to be available and put that shekel in his mouth. However he did it, I don't know. I trust him that he did it. And your answer is right. But Peter had a part to play in the process. You see, that fish wasn't on the beach wagging its tail, announcing its presence. That fish didn't jump from the water and land on Peter's lap and open up its mouth and allow Peter to see the shekel. No, Peter had to go to the harbor wall and take the line and put the bait on the hook and drop it in the water and hear the plop and wait for the tug to happen. And then he pulled it in, and there was the fish, and in the fish was a shekel. As implied in the way that our reader read the reading, just enough for Jesus and Peter. Nice touch on the part of Jesus to care for his disciple at the same time. Who did the miracle? And my suggestion to you is that Peter had a part to play. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not for 1 minute indicating that Peter had some supernatural ability to be involved in this. It was all Jesus. But Jesus had something important that he wanted Peter to know. You see, the reason that Jesus does this miracle is, yes, not to give offense to the tax collectors, but it is also to teach Peter a very important lesson. And here's the lesson. Jesus, who is God, Jesus, who has participated in the creation of the universe, Jesus, who, according to the book of Hebrews, sustains the universe from here to here, he who has all power available to him and could easily do whatever he wants immediately, says, Peter, I want you to participate with me in fulfilling my ambition. Peter, go catch a fish. I can do that. You're not asking me to do something supernatural. I've done that since I was a little boy. Well, Go catch a fish, because together we are going to achieve what I want to be achieved, that I could do on my own, but I want you to participate in the process with me. The significance to you and to me is this. You have been given talents, we have sensitivities, gifts, abilities, and they have been given for a purpose. Some of them were part of you when you were born. It is as a result of your parents that you have these gifts and abilities. Some of them have come into your lives since you become Christians. Some of them have been enhanced by the work of God in your experience, but they are there for a purpose. And one of the purposes is that you and I realize that we, together with Jesus, have a part to play in fulfilling his ambition. Preposterous, shocking, precocious, sounds it. But the creator of the universe, in effect, says, I could achieve this on my own, but I would prefer to do it with you. Because I need you? Of course I don't. I created the universe. But I want you to know that I prefer to work with you to achieve my ambition. This says something about the desire of God to work with us and for us to work with him. We are fellow workers, says Paul, with Jesus. Joint heirs. We're not being elevated to the Godhead, but we are being introduced to the fact that we are way above being servants of God, sons and daughters of God who have a part to play in ensuring that his will is achieved. Now, this is such a remarkable message that Matthew, in helping his Christians realize this truth, records the message through other stories, and I'm going to introduce another one to you. But remember the context. In a few years' time, Jesus will have gone. He will have left the Holy Spirit, that is true, as an advocate who functions just like Jesus. But the physical presence of Jesus will not be there. And Peter and Paul and the other apostles and the other Christians need to know that the work of Jesus will not stop because he has been ascended. They have the ability to achieve his plans and fulfill his will because they are co-workers with him. Partners. Junior partners, if you will, but partners. So let me take you to story number 2. Now, this is a story that's actually told by Matthew, by Mark, by Luke, and by John. It's one of the very few stories that's in all of the Gospels. But we're just going to look at it through the eye gate of Matthew. Here's the context. Jesus has been teaching all day, healing, casting out demons, spending time with thousands of people. And according to the gospel writers, there are 5,000 men at the end of the day, plus women, plus children. So maybe we're talking 10, 12,000 people. And the disciples recognize that the people are going to be fatigued and hungry. So they say to Jesus, Jesus, would you consider sending the people to the villages? They're not starving, but if they go to the bakeries and the village shops, they can get something to eat. Remember what Jesus says to them. You feed them. You feed them. Now, I wonder why Jesus said that. Was it perhaps that Jesus was a little affronted that the disciples thought that they could advise Jesus and Jesus wanted to embarrass them? I don't think so. Was it that they'd wrong-footed Jesus by giving him this advice and Jesus wanted to put them in their place? I don't think so. I actually think that when Jesus said, you feed them, he was hoping that one of them would say, okay, I will. I don't know how, because it's beyond me. You're not asking me to catch a fish like Peter caught a fish because he could do it because he was a fisherman. You're asking me to feed the people, and that demands supernatural ability, and I don't have that, but I'm going to try. Why would they think like that? Because Jesus has commissioned them. And if Jesus says, you feed them, then Jesus wouldn't have given that commission if there hadn't been the possibility that they could have fulfilled it. Not in their own strength, of course, but by taking advantage of the resources that Jesus would have made available to them if they had taken seriously his commission. Well, whatever. They missed that opportunity. And one of them says, we've got some fish and we've got some loaves, and implication being if we put everything together, then we can provide some food that will be beneficial to everybody. They won't be full, but at least they will have their appetite assuaged just a little bit. It's an interesting plan, but it's not the plan that Jesus has, of course. And Jesus' plan has at least two purposes in mind. One is Jesus wants to say something about himself, and two, Jesus wants to say something about the disciples. You see, the miracle that Jesus achieves when he feeds these thousands of people is not for the people. Of course, they will benefit from it, but the miracle is largely for the benefit of his 12 young followers. They need to learn two things. One, they need to learn something about Jesus. Think about occasions in the past in Jewish history when people have been fed supernaturally. You may think about Elisha, who fed 200 prophets with barley loaves. It was a remarkable feat, but it wasn't a miracle. The only real parallel to what Jesus did was when God, Jehovah, enabled the hungry people who were traveling from Egypt to the promised land to have manna from heaven, heavenly bread that fell on the camp. That was a God thing. That was the kind of miracle that only God could do. It was a mark of God being God. And that's the point. Jesus emulates that which God has done. You'd almost think that Jesus was indicating that he was God himself, which you and I know was the truth. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't being arrogant, but he was doing it very naturally. And the disciples need to know that the one that they are serving, Jesus, is not just the best teacher in the world. He is not just their best friend. He is not just the most remarkable healer and exorcist that has ever walked on this earth. He is not even just their savior, although he is all of those. He is also their God. I need to keep reminding myself of that truth. But it's because he is their God that then Jesus releases the second message to the disciples. And it's this. You know, he gets the 12 disciples and they're all given platters of food. They are going to participate in feeding the people. And Matthew and Mark and Luke and John record the fact that they are all involved. So put yourself in that context. There are the 12 disciples. They all have food. And you are the thousands, and I am one of the 12 disciples. And I will come to you with my platter, and I will give you some food. And those in the front rows will probably not take too much, because you know that there are thousands sitting behind you, so you will take a little. And then I will continue, and my 11 colleagues will be doing the same. Here's the remarkable thing. None of the gospel writers indicate that those disciples went back to Jesus to have those platters replenished. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that the disciples suddenly became miracle workers. I know Jesus has that ability to delegate his powers to us because he promised that. But that's not what I am indicating is taking place here. But I will ask you the question, who's doing the miracle? Just like I asked you the question with Peter. Who is doing that miracle? And who is doing this miracle of the feeding of the thousands? And you will say to me, well, of course it's Jesus. And I will say, yes, it is Jesus, because he is God who has the ability to create food out of nothing like his Father did in the Old Testament. But the disciples had a part to play in the process. That's all I'm saying. The disciples had a part to play in the process. And it must have shocked them as they continued and kept looking down at the platters, and there was still food there until they got to the end. And you know the story. At the end, there was more food left over than there was in the beginning. So quite clearly, this is a message about the supernatural nature of Jesus. But do not lose sight of the fact that this was intended to be a message for his 12 disciples. Because this would have been the ideal opportunity for Jesus to have said, I am the bread of life. Before you finish what you're eating, let me just tell you where this food has come from. I am the bread of life. He doesn't say that. This would have been the opportunity for him to say, I've been teaching you all day, but I need to remind you of something else truly remarkable. What I have done is what God has done in the Old Testament. You were looking at God when you were looking at me. He doesn't say that. Instead, it's a message to the disciples that you and I, Jesus, have achieved what I wanted to have achieved. And I could have done it on my own. Could he not? He could have easily done it on his own. 1, 2, 3, and you'll all feel full. I doubt he would have been as crass as that, but he could have easily made them full in a moment, because he is God. But he chooses to slow the process down for the benefit of his disciples, because the message they need to learn is that, yes, Jesus has not just called us to be participants who watch what he does from a distance. He has chosen to ask us to participate in his plans, in his aspirations, in his ambitions, in his objectives. Personally, I'm saying, Lord, please don't ask me, because I'm going to let you down. I'm going to slow the process down. I'm going to make mistakes. You're going to have to remedy what I have done. Please ask me in 10 years' time when I'm a better Christian. Please ask somebody else, because they're not going to mess up like I'm going to mess up. Remember, he's talking to young Christians who are young followers of his, rather. Some of them will still be teenagers. And he's saying, no, you need to know that my desire is to achieve my plans with you. I could do it on my own very easily because I am God. But I want you to know something about your status as my followers, that you can work with me in achieving my plans. And at the same time, it reminds us something of his desire to relate to us in a personal, immediate, experiential way. Preposterous. Cautious even for us to suggest that that might be the case, and that's why Matthew puts the stories in. Can I squeeze one more story in? I've not seen too many heads nodding, but I haven't seen anybody shaking your head, so I'll just squeeze one more story in, and this one is only told by Matthew, and it's to make the same point. You will remember that, and it follows immediately after this story, actually, in the Gospels. Jesus sends the disciples across to the other side of the lake, and he walks on the water. I wonder why have you ever wondered why Jesus walked on the water? And why does he walk on the water sufficiently close to the disciples so that they can see him, but they don't realize who he is? Why didn't he just go from there to there on the other side? Why didn't he somehow get from the other side in a miraculous way that only he could do? Why walk on the water? You showing off, Jesus? Why did you do that? Well, let me speculate with you. Can you think of anybody else before this moment who has ever walked on water? The answer is no. Nobody has ever walked on water except God. Psalmist speaks about God marching on the waves. The footprints, says Job, of God are on the seas. Now, you and I know that God hasn't got legs. He hasn't got feet. So this is a metaphor. It's a picture. But the symbolism behind these words is God's in charge of the sea. God's in charge of the oceans. It's something of the godness of God, that he has sovereign control over the oceans. And Jesus emulates what only God can do. And I'm sure that Jesus' hope is that the disciples will realize that when they see Jesus walking on the water. Unfortunately, they mess up, and they think he's a ghost. And Jesus comes to the boat and says, it's okay, it's me, it's me. He actually says in the Greek, I am, which you know is a name for God. Jesus comes to them because they're frightened, because they have misunderstood who Jesus is. But Jesus was doing something to help them and to help us know that he functions as God. He does what only God can do because he is Jesus. But here's where Matthew offers something that only Matthew offers. And again, Peter is central to the story, because Peter realizes who Jesus is because Jesus says who he is. And they are under no illusion that it's Jesus who is alongside of them outside the boat. And Peter says this, since it's you. Now, in some of your translations, you will have Peter saying, if it's you. The little Greek word is a, and it can be translated if, and it can be translated since. And I'm preferring to take it that Peter says, since it's you, because Jesus has already identified himself to the disciples. They know who it is because he said who he is. On the basis of which Peter says, since it's you, command me to walk on the water. Peter is not being precocious. Peter doesn't jump out of the boat and assume that because he has this faith that somehow the water isn't going to swallow him up. He only goes on the water in response to Jesus' statement, okay, come. Now, here's my point. Jesus walks on the water because he's God. He can do it because he's God. Jesus feeds those thousands because he can, because he's God. Jesus can create that fish to have a shackle in its mouth, supernatural, because he's God. And Jesus says, Peter, come and walk with me. Peter is not being cheeky. He's got courage. I suspect that I would have been at the end of the list, just seeing what's going to happen to Peter before I choose to do it. But Peter, here's the point. Here's the commission of Jesus. Come. And so he walks. He knows that he cannot walk on water, but he believes that if Jesus gives the commission, then Jesus will make it possible for him to do the impossible. And he does it. He does that which Jesus can do because Jesus is God. Peter, go catch a fish. Oh, I can do that. Well, do it. And you'll be surprised at what you will achieve in catching that fish, because you won't just catch a fish, but you will do something that will enable me to do what I want to do anyway and could do on my own, but I'm pleased to be able to do it with you. Peter, go feed those people with your colleagues. Oh, I know I could do it on my own, but I want you to enjoy sharing with me the fulfillment of my plan. I can't do it, Jesus. Well, I'm asking you to do it, and if I'm asking you to do it, then you can do it, because I will make it possible for you to do it, because I will give you the resources so to do. And yes, Peter, come and walk on the water. I know you can't, but I'm asking you to do it. Therefore, trust me that I will make it possible for you to do. So my conclusion, imagine if Jesus comes into our room this evening and sits here and begins to talk about all that he's going to be doing in your home this week, and in your college, and in your shop, in your factory, in your street, in your family, in your church. You'll be thrilled. And you may want to give him a round of applause and say, that's wonderful, Jesus. Thank you so much for bringing your supernatural power into my workplace, my home situation, my street. That's fantastic. But then imagine if he says, well, actually, I'd like you to help me. I'd like you to be involved. I would like to take advantage of your gifts, your talent, your ability. I would like to take advantage of your presence, of your smile, of your welcome, of you being you, so that together we will achieve my plans. You see, Peter was able to partner Jesus because he was with Jesus. We're all Christians. We're all followers of Jesus. But followers of Jesus who take time to listen to him may be surprised as to what he might say to us, because he might want us to be more involved in him fulfilling his plans than we would ever dream. But most of us, because we have inadequate perceptions of ourselves, because we see our weaknesses and our fragility and our fallibility, we don't for 1 minute think that we could help the creator of the universe. And it does sound preposterous. That's why Matthew puts these stories in his Gospels to help the readers, Christians like you and me, realize this remarkable truth that the creator of the universe says, I could do it on my own, but I'd love it if you share that role with me. Together, we will achieve what I want to achieve. Let me pray. Father, as I've been talking this evening, I've almost found myself battling with what I'm saying and resisting the remarkable nature of this truth, because it sounds too good to be true. It sounds too remarkable. We've been hearing from that very first reading in the Psalms just how magnificent and how grand you are. And it seems so preposterous that we should think that we can help you. And if it wasn't for the fact that you had asked us and embedded this truth in the ministry of Jesus to his disciples, we wouldn't for 1 minute think it. But if it's true, and I certainly believe that it is, then Lord, would you impress this truth upon us and this week surprise us with what we can do together in achieving your will. Thank you so much for calling us not just into your family, but into your ministry and into your mission. Thank you so much. Amen. I think we have another song, do we? We do. I didn't see any movement down here, so I wasn't too sure. Are you coming to lead this, or would you like me to? Me?